Oh, and I think where I also want to just sort of quickly educate around is then they'll share a recipe for a homemade formula. Please don't do that. Those are not safe. They are not, I mean, especially some of the, I mean, it's not okay. It's not safe. I do get very worried and scared because again, I've worked with a lot of moms and I know that a lot of decisions we make when it comes to our child are obviously in the best interest, but it can sort of have those, oh, am I doing the right thing? Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Should I be doing this? And I think that people can really prey on those insecurities and, homemade formula, no. Soy milk, cow's milk, any kind of milk before age 1 is a drink, no. Whatever formula is on the market. Protein, I think, tends to be a concern for a lot of people that it doesn't need to be. I think we can both really assure everyone, regardless of diet. And the data that we do have on vegan children also shows iron I would say, is probably the nutrient of concern. And again, that's for all children. Iron deficiency anemia is the most common nutrient deficiency in all diets. Plant-based kids actually tend to get more iron, at least what we see from the Polish studies and from the Vichy studies, but that iron is what we call non-heme.
Welcome to another episode of the Plant Fueled Podcast, where we explore the intricacies of plant-based living across all stages of life. I'm Callum, your host and plant-based nutritionist, and today we're delving into the fascinating world of plant-based nutrition for our littlest ones, with no other than Alex Caspero, a pediatric dietitian nutritionist and co-founder of Plant-Based Juniors. As someone who knows literally nothing about kids and probably needs to learn a thing or two, I couldn't be more excited to have Alex on the show. She's here to answer all our burning questions about raising plant-based children, from babies to toddlers and beyond. In this episode, Alex shares invaluable insights into the essential nutrients for kids, including the usual protein, iron, and calcium. We explore the recommendations of plant-based diets in children, addressing common concerns that parents may have, and providing practical advice on how to ensure that littlest ones thrive on a plant-based diet. From baby formulas to toddler meals, Alex covers the do's and don'ts of plant-based nutrition for kids, offering guidance that's both evidence-based and compassionate. Whether you're a parent, caregiver, or simply someone interested in the health and well-being of our youngest generation, this episode is a must listen. Before we dive into the wealth of knowledge, I want to express my gratitude to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. Your curiosity and engagement drives our mission to empower and educate through the power of plants. If you find value in today's episode, please consider leaving us a review or rating on your preferred platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue spreading the plant-powered message. So without further ado, let's learn from the best as we explore plant-based nutrition for kids with Alex Caspero. Get ready to take notes, because this episode is packed with invaluable advice for anyone who's thinking about having a small human. Let's dive in. Alex, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you.
So I think I've been really pumped for this chat for a while, because this seems to have hit a perfect moment, especially in the last few months. And I don't know why I found myself surrounded with questions surrounding the topic of plant-based kids. I always send them in your direction anyway. But however, I feel like although it's becoming more accepting that, adults can thrive on a plant-based diet, when it comes to, little humans, people seem to have a lot more questions, sometimes very defensive. And then there's sometimes a lot of curiosity as well.
Yeah. And, as I always say, rightfully so, right? I think it's one thing when you decide to make changes to yourself, but my goodness, the moment you're responsible for someone else's, health, it does really change things. And, to be honest, that's actually the reason that Whitney and I started Plant-Based Juniors. We were both dietitians. I was working in pediatrics for a little while at WIC. I worked with eating disorders in teens for a while. So I felt like, really confident in my overall pediatric nutrition knowledge. But then my husband and I have been predominantly plant-based for a very long time, and I got pregnant, and I started to question things too. I think that's a really natural thing. And so I really empathize with parents who have those questions. the thing that we say is that while we don't have the same body of research in children as we do as adults when it comes to the health benefits, we can likely assume that starting these dietary patterns even earlier in life is likely going to have the same benefits that we see in adults, if not greater, because we're starting from so much earlier. Now, that's not to say there's not specific nutrition things we really need to focus on, because pediatrics is different than adults, right? Kids were really focused on growth, whereas adults, not so much. So there's, some differences there. But overall, I really want to just sort of comfort parents in saying, yes, totally normal to have those concerns. And also, you really don't have to worry.
Yeah, I think people do kind of worry a lot more because there's so much information going around everywhere. Kind of like, you should do this, you shouldn't do this. This is going to kind of screw up a pregnancy, or your child's not going to grow properly. And it really gets vilified, I would say, a lot. And I've seen it quite a lot with people in my community that want to, have a vegan pregnancy and have vegan kids, but you're going to parents of those parents just kind of,
Totally.
can't do this. It's child abuse.
Well, and the reality is, I will say, is that there are certain nutrients that you do need to be a lot more focused on. That doesn't take a lot of effort, really, just a little bit of education. We have courses that we put out, Plant-Based Juniors. We do give a lot of free things, obviously, through our Instagram, through our blog. So, I would say to parents, yes, we really need to ensure adequate intake of iodine and B12 and vitamin D. Those things obviously are going to be a little bit harder on a plant-based diet. And also, that's not to say that just because you're omnivorous, you're automatically getting all of these things. Like I said, I worked for WIC, which is sort of our Women, Infant, and Children's program here in the United States. And I've seen a lot of deficiencies over the years, and none of those children were plant-based. So, just because you're on one dietary pattern doesn't automatically mean everything's going to go perfect. So, yes, there is some general prenatal education that's, important, but again, that's true of all pregnancies and of all children. That's why, we recommend well check visits and all of these things that really are for all kids, regardless of what dietary pattern you're following.
As you just said, obviously, that you see deficiencies all over the board as well. And I think people forget that that's a thing, because we, as a society, we are supplementing on a daily basis, no matter what you think you're supplementing. Right. Like, either that's during, whether that be, fortified milks or vitamin D added into, the dairy milk, or iodine, because iodine doesn't come in dairy, it's just from the equipment. So
sterilization, yep.
Yeah, it's just, I think people don't have that education because it's not readily available in, schools, and it's not given to people on a daily basis.
Well, and, unfortunately, so many of us do, for better, for worse, get our information from our phone. And a lot of times, that's just not the best place. Just because you can stand in a grocery store and say something that sounds intelligent doesn't mean that it's accurate. And I think that, unfortunately, what I've seen is that people so I've been a dietitian for about 16 years now. And I would say in really the last 5 or 6, there's been this huge shift of clients know more, and also they're much more misinformed. So they're having, a lot more interest in nutrition. They're coming to me and it really feels like, okay, like you're really understanding some of these more complex conversations that used to be a little bit more, I had to explain a lot more. And also the amount of misinformation, I feel like myth busting I'm doing is off the charts. And I do think a lot of it is just because this isn't taught in schools. We all have to eat. We're trying to figure out what's best. And sometimes the resources that we turn to just aren't evidence-based.
I think as well, we're now in a society, especially when you can just go onto TikTok and pick up any information from anybody that you don't know whether they're qualified or not.
14-year-old. I know. Yeah, and I think that's what's really dangerous too, and it's also easy to vilify certain headlines. So, for instance, there has been cases over the years where a quote unquote vegan child has, died or become sick. And, that's horrendous. And also it wasn't because of the vegan diet. When you really look into those cases, it was because of malnourishment. If you're feeding a child almond milk, or an infant almond milk, and that's it, that is child abuse and that is malnourishment. Just because the parents were vegan really has nothing to do with that. The same thing would happen if you fed an infant child cow's milk from the beginning. That's also malnourishment. So, I do think that we could see these sort of like really clickbaity headlines. It's easy to make them go viral on TikTok. Parents see this. And then, again, especially if you don't have this background, it's really easy to sort of start to question yourself. So, I have compassion. And also, again, that's why we hopefully say, come to Plant-Based Juniors. We try as hard as we can to be, a really inclusive community. We welcome everyone. And, we try to put out as much evidence-based guidelines and education as we can to help combat some of those myths.
So how did Plant-Based Juniors come about? Like, what was the journey that led you to this point?
Yeah. So like I said, Whitney and I are both dietitians. We had actually met a long time ago. We met in, I think, 2010 at a conference. We just happened to be kind of chummy, and we connected with each other over the years, sort of via social media, seeing each other at various conferences, etc. I became pregnant with my son in 2017. She was also pregnant with her son. And we were doing just a lot of sort of late night texting, hey, have you seen this study? Hey, what do you think about this? What multivitamin or prenatal are you doing? We were sort of having a lot of these back and forth conversations. And, we both kind of had this thought, okay, we both have master's degrees in nutrition. And we're still sort of, trying to read through the literature and have questions with each other. I bet you there's a lot of parents who also feel the same way. And so we decided to create Plant-Based Juniors just to have a resource, because at that time, there really wasn't a place that felt truly evidence-based and also plant-based. So many of the pregnancy books I bought, it was like, you want to be vegetarian? You really have to be concerned about protein and iron. And I don't want to be dismissive of iron because it is something to consider, but it just felt like there wasn't a place people could really feel secure in these decisions, especially when they're making them for reasons that even aren't related to nutrition, and want to do this and want to feel like they're supported. And that's really how Plant-Based Juniors came to be.
Because I have obviously looked through your site and everything, and it is very evidence-based. However, I feel like whenever you do look for evidence, it is hard to find when it comes to kids. I think every other nutrient you can easily find for adults and the daily requirements of things. But when it comes to children, there's very little.
Well, and to be fair, there's also very little when it comes to plant-based kids. There's been a few studies over the years. There was a Poland study, there was some Vici studies that, we reference a lot. And, to help people understand this as well, to study on children is hard, just because you really have to show ethics when you're presenting to, a review board to get your research approved. And also a lot of it is, observational, right? So most parents, I would say, if they're not already vegan, are probably not going to sign up for a study that says, put your child on a vegan diet from birth until 10. And then we'll also put kids on an omnivorous diet and then a vegetarian diet, and we'll look at these outcomes. That's not how it works. Usually it's observational. So we say, hey, parents who already have vegan children, can we sort of study your child's nutrition, various parameters, same thing with vegetarian children, same thing with omnivorous children, and then kind of compare them. But even that too, there's just only a handful of studies that have really done that. So we are basing a lot of information on what we know and can assume about adult nutrition, and then what we just sort of know from various nutrient profiles when it comes to foods and plant foods.
Yeah, I think especially for me, knowing nutrition, great, and working with adults, great. But when it does come to kids, I'm so far out of my comfort zone. I don't have any of myself, and as I know, they're all very unique at those early stages of lives as well. They're kind of learning their likes, their dislikes, and some can be very fussy, some can be little gannets, but also the nutritional needs are so different from those of an adult as well.
That's right.
it's just a minefield that I'm just kind of like, I don't want to step into that.
We got you. You send them our way. We'll help you out. Yeah, the thing I will say too is that I know it can feel scary, and I just really do want to reassure parents that yes, there are a few things we would truly want to sort of educate around, and also knowing your child. I think that's the other hard thing is not all children are, kale loving, broccoli grubbing babes, no matter what we want them to be. I always say I have 2 children. I have parented them the same. I have exposed them, I hope and I think, to, a really wide plant-based diet. I have one child who is just fairly picky and has been for, a while. And another child, I don't care what it looks like, what it tastes like, she's always down to try. So, that's their personalities too. And I think that can also be frustrating and hard when you're trying to focus on nutrition and you see sort of, foods these nutrients are high in, and you look at the list and you say, oh, well, that's great, but my child won't eat any of it. And, I think that's where also pediatrics does get a lot more specific, because it's one thing to tell an adult, hey, should you have some more, dark, lean, leafy vegetables? It's another thing to tell a 3-year-old, because they're not always down to consume them.
Yeah, I really resonate with that as well, because when I was a child compared to my sister, I was the easy, could eat anything.
You were my daughter.
Try anything. Mm-hmm. Whereas my sister, very picky. Still very picky now, to be fair.
Yeah.
But that's just people's personalities and that's preferences, right. And I think people seem to forget that although children they're small and they're still developing, they do have their preferences as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, we do a lot of education around picky eating, because I think it is one of the top just pediatric concerns, again, regardless of overall diet. And, there are some things you can do as a parent, and also a lot of it is personality and genetics. So, my husband's fairly picky. Yeah. We got 2 kids, 50-50. That's what I always joke to him. I'm like, God, I should have married someone who was just a little bit more adventurous, but I love you for everything else, so I'll take your pickiness. He doesn't always like that, but that's all right.
So what are the common concerns that come up, from parents? Because for me, in my head, mm-hmm. I would say that it's probably very much the same as what people assume on an adult plant-based diet, which was, your protein, calcium, B12, and iron, maybe omega-3.
Yeah. Let's start there. So, protein, I think, tends to be a concern for a lot of people. That doesn't need to be. I think we can both really assure everyone, regardless of diet. And the data that we do have on vegan children also shows this. So the Vici study, I believe it was 2 times the amount of protein for the RDA that children were getting. And that's even from as young as 1 to 3, even to the older children. So protein really isn't a concern. I tell parents, 2 cups of soy milk and a piece of bread, that'll get you your child's protein intake for a 2-year-old. So I think protein is much more abundant than many of us realize. And it also is not just in what we consider to be like protein-rich foods. Grains are a great source of protein. Pasta, even plain pasta, not necessarily whole grain, but even just regular old quote unquote, white pasta has 7 grams of protein per cup. So, it's really easy to meet that, not a concern. Iron is, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So when it comes to protein, I feel like it's very easy just to go over your daily recommendation anyway. That's right. I no longer, when I first went plant-based, I was like, I need to worry about protein because that's all is those worries and concerns. And then when you actually start tracking it and then realize what you're eating on a day-to-day basis, you're normally hitting over it because it's abundant in everything.
And everything. And so, I say to parents, that's really, unless there is a calorie issue, the only time I've ever seen a protein issue is when there's also an intake issue. So, what I mean by that is if your child is having a hard time eating in general, if there's some aversions to food, we'd want to work with a professional. But two, is if calorie needs are met, protein is almost always met, and then some. So again, it's just not really a concern that we need to worry about. Now, iron I would say, is probably the nutrient of concern, and again, that's for all children. Iron deficiency anemia is the most common nutrient deficiency in all diets. Plant-based kids actually tend to get more iron, at least what we see from the Polish studies and from the Vichy studies, but that iron is what we call non-heme. So it's going to be absorbed a little bit differently than an animal-based iron, which would be that heme iron. That doesn't mean that it's bad or that it's something that we really need to be concerned about. It probably, though, does mean we need to get a little bit more iron than if we were just consuming animal iron or if we were consuming a mixed diet to make up for those absorption issues. So the things that we tell parents is that serving iron-rich foods at most meals. So again, grains are good sources. Obviously, things like beans, lentils, tofu, nuts, seeds, and then also ensuring to pair it with a source of vitamin C. So vitamin C can help to stabilize that non-heme iron and help to increase absorption. We're also really down with meat alternatives. They can be a really palatable way to sort of get both protein, iron, zinc, and they're also an easy way to kind of match peer groups. If your child is like, hey, my friends love hot dogs or hamburgers, I want to be like them, great. There are some really awesome plant-based hot dogs and burgers and sausages and all that stuff on the market. They're high in sodium, so we don't recommend them every single day, but I really have very little issues when it comes to enjoying those foods as part of an overall healthy diet, especially when it comes to kids, because again, I think it's so much more than just nutrition. It's also having sort of that like social acceptance, and that can be hard when you're a plant-based kid, or harder in certain situations.
I was about to say, like, how does it work when kids then go to school and then they are surrounded by people, because obviously eating plant-based is still very much the minority. So you're in a big wide world full of, people eating all sorts, and some kids are going to feel jealous that they may not be eating that.
Yeah.
Luckily, there are these alternatives available, so we can kind of, they don't feel so, disassociated with what they can and can't eat.
And it really is true, and I think every family kind of makes that decision. We've had clients over the years who have sort of decided, hey, you know what, when my child goes out and they're at their friend's house, they can eat whatever they want. At our home, we choose to eat plant-based. My daughter is very aware of what's happening on everyone else's plate. And I remember one time I went to a birthday party and she came home and was like, why don't we ever have pepperoni pizza? And I was like, we can have pepperoni pizza. Sweet Earth, or I forget, one of the brands makes a really great, vegan pepperoni, and we made pepperoni pizza. And, she went to a birthday party and there were all these hot dogs. I knew ahead of time, so I brought her own hot dog. There are ways. It may be a little harder, but again, you may decide that when they're outside of your home, they eat differently. And also the thing that I tell parents too is that you can control a lot when they're really younger. And, at some point, your child's going to have their autonomy to be able to choose their own foods. And they may decide they want to explore those things. But all that to say is, I think sometimes meat alternatives get really unfairly demonized. And I think people are really confused sometimes on, the nutrition, but there's so many various options out there. And I think especially if it helps sort of normalize things, again, they're a lot more palatable. Not every child wants to be eating lentils and beans, and they're much more willing to eat, like tofu nuggets or, the burgers, et cetera, that we were talking about. Then, that's a great way to help introduce some of those nutrients into the diet.
Mentioning tofu, actually. So obviously, I think we know that tofu, that soy isn't bad. That gets vilified a lot as well.
Yes.
But kids and soy. as well. Like I've seen a lot of people kind of vilify and be like, you shouldn't like feed your soy like kids soy because obviously it's gonna, you know, ruin the growth and there's going to be all sorts of issues. However, obviously that's not happening with adults, and I assume it's not happening with kids.
No, and you know, I will also say that of all the foods, soy is actually probably the most researched food that we have of the last, gosh, 3 or 4 decades. I think I read something that like 2,000 papers are indexed annually on PubMed on soy alone. So it's not like, you know, certain things where it's like, oh, we're still learning, you know, we're still trying. We know a lot about soy. And we also very thankfully have various cultural diets that are traditionally very rich in soy foods that we can also look at and sort of compare notes. In fact, especially when it comes to children, I can't make the same claim for all kids because the studies have really been only done in Asian children or Asian girls, I should say. But actually introducing soy foods often and especially before puberty in girls is thought to actually reduce breast cancer risk later in life. So I have no issues feeding soy to my children. I think the only thing that I would say that we don't have data on is, you know, serving, let's say, 5, 6, 7, 8 servings of soy foods a day. You know, I think sometimes people like to talk about like, well, in traditional Asian diets, it's really only a few servings. And yes, you're correct. You know, but I also would say that for any food. You know, I don't think my children should be eating 15 apples a day either, because that's going to crowd out other nutrients, right? We really want to have a balanced diet. So a few servings of soy, I think not only from the data that we know is healthy, but likely protective.
So I've seen as well these there's a lot of baby formulas now that are soy based, which is great. But I haven't really seen any others if your kid's soy or has a soy intolerance.
Yeah.
Is there others
And
around?
so a few things on that. One, I would say soy formula is a little different as it's the only nutrition. So the studies on soy formula are going to be different than the studies on, let's say, like soy foods. There are a few instances where soy formula would not be appropriate. If your child has congenital hypothyroidism, it wouldn't be appropriate. It's not usually appropriate for premature infants, just because of the composition. So I would say that in those situations, hands down, the most ethical choice if you're using formula is to do a cows-based formula, because homemade formulas are not appropriate. You can, you know, obviously breastfeed is sort of like the quote unquote best option, but not all mothers are able to. There's a lot of barriers, especially here in America when it comes to going back to work and just access. So, you know, I definitely understand that it's not sort of the option for every woman, even though it would be the preferred source of nutrition. And so, yeah, really, the choices on the market right now would be a soy-based protein or a cow's-based. And yes, of course, if your child has a soy protein allergy, the ethical choice is going to be doing the cow's milk because that's the only other option on the market. There are some toddler formulas that are here in the United States, but toddler formula is not the same FDA approval as it comes to infant formulas. And I can't in good conscience sort of recommend them because, again, they don't have the same FDA approval as an infant formula. I do believe, though, in Australia, there is a pea-based infant formula on the market. We've heard that from some of our readers, but I don't know too much about the various sort of, what's the right word, like accreditation processes you have to go through for infant formula there.
Yeah, I've actually not seen that, but then again, I'm also not really surrounded by kids.
I'm male and not worried about it. Yeah.
But I think as well that it's good to say that obviously if you are vegan and you are having a plant-based diet and you do have a soy allergy, then obviously that your ethics need to be trumped by the
That's
kids'
right.
ethics, and you shouldn't. It's because it's obviously reducing harm in the limitations that you
That's
can,
right.
and obviously if that's the only source out there that's available to you, then absolutely go for it.
And I say that because I have had to have those really sad and difficult conversations with moms over the years. And it's heartbreaking when you want to be able to breastfeed, or for whatever reason it's not working, and then you have to go to formula, and then you find out, oh, your child has a soy protein intolerance, or has, they're not tolerating that formula. And the reality is, yes, the best option for your child is going to be that cow's milk, and it's not a shameful choice. You're making the best choice you can do for your child. And that's really what has to happen in that situation.
And it's only going to be for those early years as well, isn't
That's
it?
right.
It's not just going to, once they've reached that, when they're onto kind of like weaning onto foods.
That's right.
Um,
After 1 year. And so I do really want to reiterate too that any kind of milk besides formula, so soy milk, cow's milk, pea milk, oat milk, all whatever we're having to milk, we can use it in cooking in infancy, but it should not be a drink or a beverage until after age 1. And again, that's sort of where some of those like scary headlines can come in, because I do think parents sometimes are like, oh, my child's kind of weaning, they're on solid foods, I'll just give them soy milk. And soy milk is not the same thing as soy formula, and it can affect growth and development.
yeah, it is scary that people do assume that, but I can understand why they assume that soy milk and soy formula would be the same thing.
And
Apart from the
especially
price
when
difference.
and especially when you have, all these quackadoodles online who scare you. And, I'm thinking we have one here, Bobby Parrish, and he's constantly battering on about how harmful formula is, and, looking at the ingredients. And it's just like, hey, parents, I promise you, formula is safe. It is not poison. I don't care what formula you get. There are different also price ranges. Formula can be really expensive. It can be a barrier for a lot of families, and it's the primary source of your child's nutrition. So please ignore anyone who's trying to make you feel bad about what formula you are choosing. Anyone who is demonizing the ingredients in formula, that should be a big red flag. They probably really don't understand pediatric nutrition.
And I feel, so obviously when it comes to a child, you should be looking after their nutrition. Like when you're older and it's yourself, like it's free game to kind of ruin myself if I need to.
Yes. And I mean more, because it can seem scary. You flip over that label and you'll see things like oil and, corn syrup. And it can feel like, oh, I don't want to feed my child corn syrup. And it's like, you're not feeding your child corn syrup. The formula is safe. It is tested. It's a cheap source, unfortunately, of carbohydrates, but it's matched very well. I mean, the formula on the market these days is really good as far as being as close to human milk as we can. And so I just think that people who are trying to make mothers feel shamed or scared around their formula choices, I mean, I've got a lot of words for them, because it's just awful.
Yeah, there is a lot going around, and I think that it is just due to because anybody can just kind of go online now, say anything, and just people will follow them as long as they say it with like a load of conviction.
Yeah,
they're fine.
Well, and they're like, oh, don't feed. Well, and I think where I also want to just sort of quickly educate around is, then they'll share a recipe for a homemade formula. Please don't do that. Those are not safe. They are not, especially it's not okay. It's not safe. I do get very worried and scared, because again, I've worked with a lot of moms, and I know that a lot of decisions we make when it comes to our child are obviously in the best interest, but it can sort of have those, oh, am I doing the right thing? Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Should I be doing this? And I think that people can really prey on those insecurities. And homemade formula, no. Soy milk, cow's milk, any kind of milk before age 1 is a drink, no. Whatever formula is on the market that's well tolerated by your child is a great option.
So B12 is
yes,
a big,
B12. Let's talk B12.
A big one, and that's on adults as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing that I think that we are, again, when we talk about some of these deficiencies, unfortunately, especially when it comes to things like iodine and iron and B12, it can be harder, much harder to correct those deficiencies in childhood than it is in adults. And so we really want to ensure that we are optimizing intake from day one. So we tell all of our moms who are trying to become pregnant, you need a supplement with B12. I don't care if you're drinking a fortified milk. I don't care if you are putting nutritional yeast on all of your food. It's probably not enough. B12 is a fairly inexpensive supplement. And just because you know this of the way that B12 is metabolized and absorbed, you need much higher levels if it's going to be taken in a single dose. And our recommendations are pretty conservative. I would say, even compared to some other sort of, vegan nutrition, quote unquote, experts, we like 250 micrograms a day for pregnancy and for lactation. And that's just to really ensure that there's enough for mom and also enough for baby. That's at the higher level of what we see in research, but we just feel like the safer option is to sort of take more because it is a water soluble vitamin and there really isn't a harm in taking a little bit extra. And I'd much rather you have higher than be insufficient, again, especially when it comes to that little baby.
When do you start supplementing a child as well with B12? Like, I'm assuming that's not just once they pop out, you just...
That's right. That's right. Yeah. All right, time for your drops. No, the only supplement that's recommended right after infancy, and that's only if a mom is exclusively, or I would even argue partially breastfeeding, is vitamin D. B12, you would want to start once they're weaned. So if you're breastfeeding, and I would say breastfeeding really until age 1, because by then you're still doing, at least probably 3 feeds a day. Then as long as you're taking enough as the mom, again, that 250 micrograms, then you're passing enough on to your child. But if your child is weaned off of formula or sort of really decreasing their breastfeeds, then that's when we'd want to give them their own. And we do have a free supplement guide for parents that sort of breaks down when and what things to consider. But I even say that, there's data on vegetarian kids that are low in B12. So I think it's just a really good idea if you are anywhere, we say sort of on the plant-based spectrum. So if you're predominantly plant-based, if you're vegan, if you're vegetarian, if you're flexitarian, supplementing with B12 again is fairly inexpensive and just a really good way to ensure adequate intake.
Is there different levels of absorption with children as well? Like, because obviously with adults, there's some people that can't absorb, and is that the same when it comes to kids as well?
No. So we need something called intrinsic factor in order to absorb B12. That actually tends to decrease as we age, which is why, again, regardless of diet, older people tend to be a little bit more deficient in B12 because they're sort of decreasing that balsamic acid, intrinsic factor, which is needed to absorb B12. We don't see the same thing in children, but if we're having that single dose, you're probably, let's say, only absorbing maybe, 1 microgram of a dose. And then from there, maybe 1 to 2%. So, if you're taking, let's say, 250 micrograms, you're not really absorbing that amount, but you are trying to get that's going to be enough to actually ensure you're getting that 2.6 micrograms, which is the RDA here in the United States. So I say that because I know parents who are like, oh my gosh, it says on the label, it's 200 times the RDA. And that feels scary. That's a lot. Does my child need all that? And the reality is, yes, in a single dose. The reason it doesn't matter if you're eating B12 from animal foods throughout the day is because you're sort of slowly absorbing it throughout the day. But in that single dose, yeah, you need higher levels. And again, we do have a free supplement guide that kind of helps to walk parents through. And we also have blog posts all about this topic.
I'll definitely be linking everything on your website in the show notes. What's just stopping a parent just popping a multivitamin? Because obviously you see it's got B12 and it's got
that's right. I would say the only issue I have with the vast majority of multivitamins, now I don't know, the Australian market the way I do the United States market. But I have yet to find a child's multivitamin in the United States that has enough of that B12. So usually it's great, take a multivitamin and then also just take a little bit of the B12. The other thing I will say too, and some families could get by too with if they take a multivitamin and they consume a lot of fortified foods with B12. Our only sort of hesitation, and it's not obvious by now, we are very conservative when it comes to our recommendations, just because I sort of live by the like safe than sorry kind of rule when it comes to peds. But if your child is picky and some days they have fortified milk, but some days they don't, or sometimes they don't finish that smoothie and that's the only source you've relied on, that's where it could be a little bit more dicey and where we'd rather rely on supplements. But that's not to say you couldn't make it work with fortified foods once you get into childhood where the levels are a lot lower than it would be in pregnancy and lactation. The only thing I also do want to quickly mention is iodine. Because iodine, especially iodine deficiency, there is a point where it's irreversible in childhood, and iodine is really found in dairy. Again, we talked because of the sterilization, and in seafood. And so even if you're, vegetarian and really not consuming a lot of dairy, or if you're vegan, or if you are flexitarian but not eating a lot of those foods, there's a potential you could be iodine deficient. We've seen some, increases in various pockets of iodine deficiency. And I say the easiest way is to do an iodized salt. That's how we do it in my family, because it's a great way to easily get an iodine. You can do iodine drops. Multivitamins, a lot of multivitamins also contain iodine. The only tricky thing with iodine, it's like Goldilocks. You don't want too little and you don't want too much, because both can be, not great, especially when it comes to thyroid health. So I wouldn't just tell parents, hey, just go get any iodine supplement. If you're going to go that route, we'd really want you to be cautious and ensure that you're not giving too much. But that is a nutrient that I do think is probably going to come up more and more as more of the world is sort of leaning into plant-based diets, just because, my sort of prediction is that more plant-based milks will be adding iodine, because that tends to be the best source in kids who drink cow's milk, and, a nutrient we're a little bit more aware of ensuring adequate intake on.
Yeah, iodine was one of those things that I actually didn't realize existed until I started studying nutrition.
Yeah.
I had no idea it existed, and I'm very just nori sheets for me and kind of other seaweed-based foods.
Yeah.
Because when you see it, you assume it is cow's milk, but you're never too sure how much you're going to be getting in there. So
That's right.
Is kind of supplemented into the cow's milk as such with the equipment.
That's right. And you really can't know, because it's not on the label. You're not going to be able to look and see how much iodine, even with plant foods, it can also vary too based on soil. So, I don't say any of this to scare, but again, just to educate, like we were going back to our very original conversation. I think plant-based diets for children are so wonderful, especially when you compare it to sort of the standard American diet. But there are, a few key nutrients we'd really want to ensure that we're getting. And I also will say, I know this from, working with a lot of clients, is sometimes they'll say, you know what, for my family, I think it actually is going to be a better choice for us to be predominantly plant-based. And then we're going to, get some of these nutrients from animal foods, and that works for us. And that's okay too. One message that I really also want to just say is that every single bit of plant-based eating is beneficial. 10% of kids here in the United States meet their fruit and vegetable intakes every day. So the more plants that we can get on the plate, the more that we can start, introducing these foods earlier in life. Research shows that the foods that we eat in childhood become part of our food culture and tend to be the foods that we also like into adulthood. So if we can start to sort of introduce these foods, whether it's 100% of the time or 80%, even 50%, it's going to be a lot better than what the current standard is.
Absolutely. I think from my understanding of child nutrition, which isn't much, is that fat is more crucial
That's right.
for children than it is for adults.
Yes, yes. And we didn't even talk about DHA. Oh my gosh. Yes. So that is absolutely true. Especially in the sort of subset sometimes that we see in the vegan community of people who want to be, oil free or very low fat vegan. That's great if that's what you want to do as an adult. I would absolutely not recommend that for a child. Children need in the first year of life, it's, 35, 40% of those calories from fat. Now, breast milk and formula is going to do a lot of that heavy lifting, but we wouldn't want to not give fat. And the same is true in early childhood. We're still sort of looking at that 30, 35%. And, especially if we're eating a very whole food plant-based diet, that can be harder to find because, plants just tend to be a little bit lower naturally in fat. So really making sure, you're offering avocado, you're cooking with, olive oil, and you're, adding those nuts and those seed butters to your child's meals to help ensure adequate fat intake. We at PBJs, I should say, believe the research is there to ensure adequate intake of DHA in the first 1,000 days of life. So really from conception to about 2 years old. DHA is a long chain omega-3 fatty acid. It is primarily found in fatty fish. And ALA is sort of the plant-based version that's found in things like flax seeds and chia seeds and walnuts. The conversion rate is very, very low in pregnancy, in breastfeeding, and really in early childhood. And so that's one of the reasons that ALA is important. We should really be, consuming those yummy foods too. But it's probably a good idea if you can afford it to supplement with DHA in pregnancy while you're breastfeeding. And then once your child is 2, after that, we sort of say it's optional. DHA supplementation tends to be the most expensive supplement. Hopefully that's changing with more of the plant-based options coming online, but that can be a barrier for some families. But we'd really sort of want to prioritize, again, conception to age 2. And then from there, if you want to still consume it, great.
Absolutely. And I think calcium, that's also just another giant one that I see everywhere.
And that's true I will also say too, that's true for all kids. Calcium, again, tends to be a nutrient that is low in omnivorous children. It's low. It is a little lower in vegans. It's one of the reasons we are so down with fortified milk. And, we tell parents again, I know that a lot of parents love making homemade almond milk and making their own milks, and that's great. But you're probably missing that calcium because it's not going to be fortified. And the reality is most kids I know aren't downing 7 to 8 cups of broccoli a day. So, really ensuring intake of calcium, hands down, the easiest way is going to be a fortified plant milk. So we love it. My kids, I cook oatmeal, I would say a lot of mornings, and I do it with some plant milk, fortified. I usually do fortified soy milk. We do smoothies a lot. I make popsicles a lot. They drink it. It's just an easy way to ensure those nutrients. And again, childhood is a period of growth. We really want to maximize bone density in childhood. And so ensuring adequate intake of calcium, vitamin K, potassium, all these sort of nutrients we need for strong bones. It is so much actually more critical in childhood than it's going to be, let's say, for you and I at our age. Calcium is still important, but it's not quite as important when we're in these periods of rapid growth.
Yeah, but it is just that growth spurt and the growing at that time, isn't it? Whereas obviously my age, I'm not growing anymore.
Yeah, we're not trying to put 30 pounds on you in 4 years, right?
Exactly.
But childhood is different, and we want that. And I do think that the few studies that have come out regarding vegan growth, it sometimes is related to this idea. It's not much; it's like a centimeter, but a lot of it is, well, what's the calcium intake look like? and if parents are not focused on fortified plant milks, then, it doesn't have to be the only way. But I do think sometimes there is this hyper focus on, we don't want anything processed. We only want to eat sort of a whole food, plant-based diet, and I think that's great. And again, for adults, that's a lot different. In my nutrition, I can prioritize things like chia seeds and, kale and broccoli, but it's a lot harder in a 2-year-old to do that, especially with a smaller stomach and food preferences. And, I think sometimes we have to think about nutrition a little bit differently when it comes to our kids and ensure we're meeting them where they're at. And, plant milks, even cow's milk, I mean, it is an easy source of calcium. There's other issues with cow's milk, but, the one thing I will say is it is an easy source of calcium. And that's why fortified plant milk is sort of that like 1-to-1 easy swap in. Our best recommendations would be a soy or a pea. You're going to get similar fat. You're going to get adequate calories. It's also going to be a source of choline, which other plant milks aren't going to have. And, again, we do want to sort of maximize calories for growth. And if you're looking at, let's say, giving a toddler 2 cups of fortified milk a day, there is a difference between, let's say, a 30-calorie almond milk versus a more nutrient-dense soy milk.
Yeah, I kind of forget that there are all these different milks as well.
There's so many, yeah. Which is great. I know, yeah. I love it.
I'm maca milk at the moment, so macadamia, which is real good. It's real. I don't really
creamy.
Like almond milk with the nuttiness, but macadamia, it has a slight twinge of it, but it's got that creamy taste to it.
I've never had almond milk outside of, there's a coffee shop in LA that has they make their own macadamia nut milk, and they do it with like an iced coffee. Oh, I mean, it is so good. Anytime I go to LA, I'm like, we have to go to this place to get it. But
so when it comes to kids, we know they're picky eaters. They're very picky eaters sometimes.
Yeah.
How do we kind of get around that when we're trying to feed them obviously the best foods possible and very kind of more towards whole foods as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of different strategies, and we go over this in our kid nutrition course. So the things I would tell parents is 1, patience, a lot of patience. 2, I would say, remembering that in general, it's sort of like exposure and time. Those are the 2 biggest things that we've got to do when it comes to more selective eaters. And exposure can mean a lot of things. So I would tell parents, keep serving all of those foods. My son is like so funny about the things he's into. And, he tells me all the time how much he loves cucumbers. I don't think I've seen him eat a cucumber in a good 6 months. But I serve those cucumbers all the time because he tells me how much he loves them, and great. I still want to offer, I still want to expose them, even if he's not choosing at that moment to actually eat them. I think it can be a really slippery slope. And I know this because I know it's easy to do so. You sort of tend to cater to your child's needs. They say things like, I don't want the red pepper. And so you just stop serving red pepper. And that might be an easy sort of short-term win, but it also doesn't allow your child to be exposed to that food. And that's really what they need. And also exposure can be not just eating the food or having that food on their plate. It can be cutting it. It can be going to the grocery store. It can be reading about it. It can be, watching you eat it. There's a lot of different, we're sort of trying to normalize it, right? We're trying to normalize these foods. The more normal and less scary these foods are, the more accepting they're probably going to be for our children. And then the other thing I will say is that while you're doing all of this exposure, and it can take time, and when I say time, that also could mean years. 1, picky eating is very normal. It's very developmentally appropriate. Back when we were running around and didn't have all these people on TikTok to tell us what to do, we were experimenting and our body was trying to protect us. So, what foods we were trying to avoid? Bitter foods, because they tended to be a lot more poisonous. And so little kids are much more less likely to enjoy bitter flavors. Vegetables obviously are going to be a little bit more bitter tasting, and breast milk is very sweet. So again, we're biologically sort of wired to prefer sweet carbohydrate rich foods that give us calories, but also are reminiscent of mother's milk. So you got biology working against you, parents. It's really tough. And then also I will say, while all that's happening, trying to maximize nutrition while you can. And so that's where we do a lot of like recipe tips, like if you're like, hey, my child's not eating a lot of these vitamin A rich foods, can you blend some pureed pumpkin into your spaghetti sauce? Can you make pumpkin muffins? Can you, make these ways that you're not hiding the food, because we don't want our kids to feel like they're being tricked. But there are ways that you can sort of maximize nutrition. Like I always joke, like when it's smoothie time, I cram everything in, I'm just going to the pantry and just throwing it all in, hoping for the best. And it's like, that's a nutrient packed smoothie. And that's a great way to sort of get some of those nutrients in that I know my son probably wouldn't eat if it was in a different form.
I think as well, exposing those kids to foods so early on as well as creating healthier habits down the line as well.
Yeah. And it's again, like I said before, I think a lot of it is just normalizing, like my kids think tacos. When you think about like, tacos, like it's lentil tacos, like they think it's so funny when we go out to eat and, we're at like taco places and they're like, where are the lentil tacos? I'm like, I don't know. Where are the lentil tacos? Because like, that's like the tacos that we eat in our house, and I think the more and more that we can make these foods acceptable, again, however our child's dietary patterns end up working out in adulthood, they're much more likely to sort of like and enjoy the foods from childhood. And so if we can make those foods whole grains and fruits and veggies and legumes and nuts and seeds, they're not so weird or so, off-putting in adulthood. And I think a lot of parents, especially if they were pickier in childhood and sort of remember like, oh my gosh, yeah, I had to sort of like teach myself to like these foods when I was adults. Hopefully it's easier if we get to them a little bit younger.
Yeah, because I think with once you've created those healthy eating patterns as well, you kind of, as you grow older, you're more aware, you're more willing to try things. You're not as picky as well. Because I still know people, real good friends that are still very picky eaters.
My husband, were you guys friends?
And it's just it's a shame, but I always feel like it does feel stem from childhood.
Yeah.
Like where people are kind of like hiding or they're just not trying new things, and it's the safe food you're going with.
That's right. And I will sort of, end all this by saying too, nutrition is important. The most important thing that you can do for childhood nutrition is to make the family dinner table a really enjoyable experience. So, nutrition is important. Yes, we've talked for a while about that. Connection is much more important. Enjoyment around food is so much more important. Fostering those habits are going to help you way more in the long run than forcing your child to eat things. Picky eating is also developmentally appropriate because it becomes a battle of wills, right? So our children around age 2 start to sort of, hey, I've got control around things and I've got control about what goes in my body. And that's they don't have a control about a lot of things, and that's a huge control thing for them. And as most parents know, you're not going to win with a 2-year-old, right? So the more pressure, the more that we make the dining experience miserable for everyone, the harder it's going to be to correct those habits. And that's why we talk a lot about like no pressure, I want my kids to have so much fun at the table at dinner time and enjoy that experience. Yeah, nutrition is important. I would like it if my son would eat some of those cucumbers, but I'm way more focused on the time we're spending together, the food that's in front of us, and how many bites he's eating to sort of, make sure we're tracking all of that stuff. Because I think that's where it can also lead into a really anxiety-provoking slope for parents.
I love that. So I'm going to wrap this up in a second. But where can we find you?
Oh, we are on Instagram at Plant-Based Juniors. We are also on plantbasedjuniors.com. Myself and Whitney, so Whitney English is sort of the other dietitian at Plant-Based Juniors. We've also teamed up with Dr. Reshma Shah. You may know her as the author of Nourish. We created a platform called the Learning Center, and we have a course for dietitians, for doctors, for nurses. It's a 35 CME accredited course with Rush University on pediatric nutrition. And then we also have courses for parents, and we have, lots of free recipes and blog posts, that free supplement guide. So we've got a lot of things going on over at plantbasedjuniors.com. Again, I think that our overall goal, we sort of have two. One is we want to help, put more plants on all kids' plates. And we also want to really help educate parents who are choosing the vegan and vegetarian sort of plant spectrum lifestyle for their child to ensure they have the education and the resources that they need.
Perfect. I will link those all in the show notes as well,
Thank
so
you.
people have access to it as well. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful for your time.
Yeah, this is so fun. I'm sorry I have to go run and grab my kiddos, but this has been great. I could have talked to you for so long. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, same here. Thank you.